Thank you, Shay. All right.
Okay, good evening, everybody.
Yeah, good evening, Bukumi.
Yes, sir. In our last class, we looked at organizational context. We looked at clause 4 and 5, and we made us understand that so under clause 4, we have four sub clauses under it. Which for clause 4.1 talks about understanding the organization and its context. And also under that point, he made us understand that it has to do with internal and external issues that can actually affect the business. And also, clause 4.2 talks about understanding the needs of the interested parties. And it made us understand that interested parties can be internal and external, and that they can also affect the organization, or your organization decision can affect them. Where you made those, we talked about where you used what was the name of this person? Spidality as an example. I also talked about this related to one Nestle stock issue really back. I can't really remember the person's name. Then clause 4.3 talked about determining the scope of information security management, also to identify the coverage of ISMS and all. And clause we now have to go to clause 5 where he talked about leadership. Also, one thing that I gained from that part is when you talk about leadership, you talk about a situation whereby you're working in an organization where they've not implemented ISO 27001, and that you want to do that. You told us procedures that can be used where you talked about you have to create a business case first, and also you make them understand the threats to the business if they don't implement it. We also talked about the cost, the project timeline, and then project approval. And you made us understand that ISO 27001 is drawn from mostly regulatory management and management need. And most times when management actually approves of it, you don't need to go through the whole process of trying to convince them to implement ISO 27001. You talk about a lot of things though, so I don't want to like take our time to start explaining and explain and explain. Thank you.
All right. All right. Um, Daniel Sholari, what was your take home in the last class? Daniel Sholari. Okay. Folashade Adepoju, what was your take home in the last class?
All right, so my take home in the last class, like I wrote here, was that before we can implement clause 4, that there needs to be an understanding of the mission, the objectives, the values, and the strategies. Then one thing you made mention of that about the key pillar of implementation of ISO 27001 is about the leadership. That's like clause 5, that it gives the utmost value to the implementation of security management, that without the leadership support you can like move on. So the summary of like what I understood, that clause 4 is the context of the organization. It helps ones to know and understand the scope and the environment of the industry. Then the leadership, that when we, like she said earlier, that when you get the approval of the top management and they're able to buy in into the idea of the implementation, you'll be able to move on faster because you don't need to start like to convince them on why you need to implement ISO 27001.
Okay. That's a good one for Miri and Folashade. Today we'll just go on to risk management. But before we go on to risk management, whether or not we finish this training tomorrow, let's plan for the exam to be written on Wednesday. We'll communicate. That's for those that are in the 33 initiative group. We'll communicate. Just plan for 9 p.m. 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. wherever you are. So we'll communicate the details. It's going to be online. We'll share the link to the exam with you, and then everybody will share their screen. All right. So and then we'll review from here as you carry out your exam. Everybody puts on their video, and they will take the exam from there. So today we'll look at risk management. Risk management falls under clause 6, planning. We'll look at documentation management. We'll touch clause 7 today. I'll skip clause 8 because clause 8 is speaking about operations of the standard, and that is where the implementation of the annex controls come in. So I'll talk about clause 9 and 10 tomorrow, and then Monday we'll look at annex control. We should be done by Monday, God willing, right? Yeah. Okay. So let's go on to risk management. Now, risk management is one of the most important parts in the implementation of the ISO 27001. Very, very important. And the moment you miss out on risk management, you necessarily not get value from the standard per se, right? So we'll look at risk management in terms of planning for the information security management system, and then before we move on from that. Now, clause 6, planning. We've looked at clause 4, clause 5. Bukumi and Folashade already made justice to that, right? So today we'll be looking at clause 6 and clause 7, where clause 6 starts with actions to address risk and opportunity. Action to address risk and opportunity. And then we have clause 6.1.1, which talks about addressing risks that come from your internal issues, addressing risks and opportunities that come from your external issues, and then even your interested parties. And I think I've explained this at length. If you were not part of the last class context of the organization, where I was talking about actions that you can put in place, because the identification of your internal and external issue is you'll be able to understand and identify actions that can be in place to address the risks that can come from your internal and what am I sharing? Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see what I'm sharing?
Yes, so what you're showing is risk management, ISO 331,000, blah, blah,
I
blah,
think I
section
have
12.
left that. So let me reshare. Yeah, I've left that place. Okay. So yeah, plus 6.1.1. Now, typical examples of the internal issues that we gave in the context when we were looking at clause 4, and one of them was okay, let's say insider threats. It's an internal issue. Now, let me ask James Sui, what are the actions that you think an organization can put in place for insider threats? James has dropped. Okay. Michelle, Emmanuel, what are the Michelle, can you hear me?
Hello, I can hear you.
Yeah. So
Clearly.
what are the actions that you think organizations can put in place for an internal issue like insider threats? What are the actions? Yeah.
Yeah, two actions comes to the top of my head.
Okay.
The first will be proper offboarding of employees. For instance, a staff leaves the company, all assets and privileges that the employee has to the company should be properly taken off by the IT team. So, and the other one is preventing shadow IT, making sure that all softwares and all programs used in the company is approved by the IT team, and not just any employee installing any softwares or any kind of program for personal use or any program that might aid the work go faster. Just only applications approved by the IT department.
Yeah, very good, very good. That's one of the actions you can put in place. Also, for internal threats, insider threats rather, some of the actions can be you want to carry out background checks before you onboard somebody. I remember some years ago I was managing a project for an organization, and then they onboarded a director. They onboarded somebody who was a director, and during that onboarding, they did not carry out proper due diligence. And because of that, MasterCard had to blacklist them because the director that they onboarded was on MasterCard watch list, terrorist watch list. Now, because of that onboarding that was not carried out, it became an issue to them. Right. So the identification of internal and external issues, the identification of requirements from interested parties helps to be able to put actions in place to address the risks and opportunities that can come from those issues or from those interested parties. Remember that I mentioned also that when we say issues, we are not talking about negative things. It can either be negative, it can be positive, right? And then in as much as issues can bring risks, whether internal and external issues, in as much as interested parties and their requirements can also bring risk, they can also bring opportunities to the business. I gave a typical example of an external issue that can be maybe changes in government policies. Now, changes in government policies is an issue. It can be a risk, it can be an opportunity. It can be a risk if the organization failed to be in compliance with that government policy. It can also be an opportunity that they can exploit if they are in compliance and other businesses that are within the same jurisdiction that play in the same space are not in compliance. Now, for an organization that has identified their external interested parties or identified also their external issue as changes in government policy, what are the actions that they can put in place to address those risks and opportunity? And that is what clause 6.1.1 is saying. It says, when planning for the information security management system, the organization shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1 and the requirement, that's your requirement of the interested parties, referred to in 4.2, and determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed to ensure that the ISMS can achieve its intended outcome. Because if you do not address the risk from those internal and external issues that you have identified, if you do not exploit the opportunity from those internal and external issues that you have identified, your information security management system may not be able to achieve its intended outcome. And then you can see the flow from context of the organization, clause 4, to leadership, clause 5, to planning the information security management system, clause 6. This is telling that if there is a mistake at every point in time in the implementation of the standard, the organization may not get the actual value that they are supposed to get. Right. And that's why it's important that organization pay attention when carrying out this implementation. Right. And part of the planning for the information security management system, clause 6, is also our risk assessment and risk treatment, clause 6.1.2 and clause 6.1.3, which is still also part of planning, because you have identified the organizational context, you have put leadership process in place. Now you are planning to address risks and opportunities within your information security management system. And then the ISO 27001 risk management is asset-based. I am not saying you cannot follow other process to carry out risk management in the ISO 27001. However, most times you see organizations implementing it using the assets within the organization. So you start from identifying the assets that you have within the organization and then carrying out an appropriate risk assessment on those assets. And tomorrow I'll do I'll explain, we'll do a practical risk assessment tomorrow or maybe tonight. So let's see how that goes. Tonight or tomorrow we'll do that so that we have more understanding. Now let's look at what 6.1.2 is saying. It says the organization shall define and apply. Very simple and straightforward. The standard have stated what they want you to do. It says you as a company define, definition, which means document, and apply, which means implement. When you document it, implement it. Since the organization shall define and apply an information security risk assessment process. What this is saying is that there is a document that is called risk assessment process. You as an organization must define that risk assessment process. You as an organization must apply, after definition, that risk assessment process. Now, it is now telling you what they want to be in that risk assessment process. Very beautiful standard. They've already told you, define and apply a process that is called risk assessment process. Now, in that risk assessment process, there are things that we want you to have in the risk assessment process. And then there are things that the risk assessment process must stand for. Number one, the risk assessment process must establish and maintain information security criteria. So this information security criteria is in different fold. Number one is speaking about your risk appetite. You as an organization, what is your risk appetite? So when I say risk appetite from the English word appetite is what you as an organization know that you can eat. You will eat it, you will swallow it, and you'll be okay. So let me give you a typical example there. You know, back then in school, when I was in my ND days, then we were not responsible for anybody. So we're just going to school, and then sometimes we can leave the school maybe 11 p.m. Maybe go to the beach and then leave the beach 1 a.m., leave the beach 2 a.m. sometimes. So sometimes we will be driving on the road and be doing carries on the express. You understand? So that was when we were still back in ND. Now, something happened when I finished my HND. Everybody had gone their way. And then a friend of mine, a friend of ours, we have a group chat, reached out and said, he's planning his birthday on the beach. Very fantastic. So he said it's going to be overnight. Okay. Yeah, we'll come. Then later he called us and said, you know what, it will not be overnight anymore. No plan to stay on the beach. We all are going to leave by 1 a.m. And then I sat down. At this point in my life, I'm responsible for some set of people, right? There are people that are on my payroll, right? There are people that, so let's just leave that. So at this point in time, I did a risk assessment. I was like, okay, I cannot leave my house very late on so and so day, and then leave the beach by 1 a.m. So I looked at possible scenarios. What if so and so thing happened on the road? What if there was this? What if there was that? What I'm trying to say in essence is that when I was in ND then, my appetite was at a certain level, and then I could accept the risk at that particular time. But I've gotten to another level now where the appetite now differs. It's different from my appetite before. So risk appetite is when you as an organization, you're able to identify some certain level of risk to say, okay, this risk, we can accept it. If anything happens, if this risk materializes, we'll accept it. We are good to go. And then there are some certain level of risk that you say, no. This particular risk, there is no way we are going to accept this risk. We need to mitigate it, or we need to avoid that particular risk. So the standard is saying you should define and apply a risk assessment process that establish and maintain security risk criteria, which your risk appetite is part of the risk criteria. Also, the criteria that will initiate the implementation of a risk management process or risk assessment process. The criteria can be, number one, the initial implementation of an ISMS. So once there is an initial implementation of an ISMS, you know that you will do risk assessment. If it is the first time you are implementing for a company, there must be a risk assessment. Number two, another risk asset, information security risk criteria will be when there is a significant change, a critical change. Maybe you want to make a change to a particular system, or maybe a production database, right? Or maybe a very key resource within the organization. And you know that you cannot just go straight and make that change. That change has to go through risk assessment, which is also part of the risk criteria. Also, when there is change to information security assets, when you get new assets within the organization and they need to carry out another risk assessment on that asset. So these are information security risk criteria. Also, the standard says the process should ensure that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. So what this is saying is that Today you are not using 5x5. Tomorrow you are using 3x3. Next tomorrow you are moving to 9x9. So you should be able to identify the process in which you are going to carry out your risk assessment, your risk acceptance criteria. Not that today you are using a low risk acceptance, tomorrow you are using a medium risk acceptance, next tomorrow you are using above average, right? Even though these things can change over time, maybe every 2 years or 3 years you can do a review, but there are not things that should be changing overnight to ensure that you have repeated information security risk assessment and then they produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. And then it says the risk assessment process should identify information security risks. And then where identification is comes in is the identification of your assets, the identification of the vulnerabilities to those assets, the identification of the threats to those assets, the identification of the likelihood and impact of risk on those assets. And then it now goes on to say, analyze the information security risk. So it is saying your process should ensure that there's an analysis. And where analysis comes in is the multiplication of the likelihood and your impact. When you have identified the likelihood and impact, the multiplication of likelihood and impact is where analysis comes in. I'm not saying you cannot multiply, add any other thing. For instance, some organizations, they multiply likelihood, impact, and asset value, right? So it is dependent on the organizational process. However, most times you will see organizations just multiplying the likelihood and impact to get the risk assessment score. So once you have carried out analysis of the information security risk and there's multiplication of your impact and your likelihood, the next thing is evaluation. Because from establishing your risk management criteria in A, where you have identified your risk appetite, and then where you have analyzed your risk assessment here in multiplying your likelihood and impact, the next thing is, because after multiplication of your likelihood and impact, you get what we call a risk score. From here, you multiply the likelihood, you multiply the impact, you get a risk score. Once you get that risk score, the next thing is to carry out what we call evaluation. Because you have identified your risk appetite here, you now evaluate the result of your analysis. That is the risk score that you have gotten from your analysis. You are evaluate that result with your risk appetite. Now, let me give a typical example. If your risk appetite here is 4, you have identified your risk appetite as 4, and then you carried out your analysis here. Let's say your likelihood is 3, and then your impact is 5. So 3 times 5 is 15. That is your risk score. 15. By the time you evaluate your risk score against your risk appetite, you see that your risk score is above your risk appetite. So evaluation now puts you in the process of risk treatment, and that's what takes you to clause 6.1.3. So you can see that the standard is structured. Clause 6.1.2 is talking about risk assessment. Please don't make mistake. Risk assessment is not risk management. Risk assessment is not risk management. Risk management is the combination of your risk assessment, your risk treatment, right? Your risk assessment from identification, analysis, evaluation to treatment. That's risk management altogether. But risk assessment just contains identification of information security risk, analysis of information security risk, evaluation of information security risk. And the risk treatment is another topic on its own. However, your risk assessment is an input into your risk treatment, because once you carry out an evaluation and you evaluate your risk score against your risk appetite, you'll be able to identify which risk you are going to accept. Some organizations they treat risk acceptance as if it's not a treatment option. Acceptance is a treatment option. If you're accepting a risk, you are treating that risk. So it's still part of your treatment option. So after evaluation, whether you are accepting, whether you are mitigating, whether you are avoiding, whether you are transferring, it takes you to your risk treatment. And that's where clause 6.1.3 comes in. Now, 6.1.3, risk treatment. So after evaluation, I don't know why this thing is not moving now. Let me stop sharing and share again. If you are following, give me a thumbs up. All right. So after evaluation, right? Please confirm you can now see my screen. Can't share screen. This is interesting. Oh God. I don't know why the system has decided to. I think this system needs a junior brother.
You meant senior,
Okay,
bro.
great. Okay. So 6.1.3. Now, once you are done evaluating, you have carried out your risk assessment, it goes to risk treatment. Now look at what the standard is saying. And if your company has implemented 27,001 before, or you've come across 27,001, you've seen some of their documents, I need you to start picturing some of those things. Look at what this standard is saying. It says the organization shall define and apply a risk treatment. You know that the first one is risk assessment. Now, this one is risk treatment process. And that is why in a lot of organizations, what you are going to see, the document you are going to see will be a risk assessment and treatment process document. Because the standard is not saying they must be standalone documents. And because they also feed into themselves, you can combine those documents together. Those process documents can speak to each other. Now, what is the standard saying should be in that risk treatment process document? It says select appropriate information risk treatment option. Because now look at the continuation. It says taking account of the what? Who can complete this sentence for me? Taking account of the what? Where are my students to
Taking account of the risk assessment result.
taking account of the risk assessment result? So you can see that the result from evaluation in clause 6.1.2, 6.1.3 is reminding us that we should take account of that risk assessment results to be able to select appropriate risk treatment option. So whether you want to accept that risk, whether you want to transfer that risk, whether you want to avoid that risk, whether you want to mitigate that risk. And then it says determine all controls. You can see where your 93 controls come, your annex controls. So your annex controls are within your clause 6.1.3, information security risk treatment. Because if you carry out a proper risk assessment and risk treatment, it will help you to identify within those 93 controls, relevant controls that you need to implement to ensure that you have a standard information security management system. So it says determine all controls that are necessary to implement the information security risk treatment options choosing. And then it says compare the controls determined in 6.1.3b and those in Annex A. So you as an organization, you have identified the risk. You have stated controls that you need to put in place. It is now saying, remember that we have 93 controls in Annex A. Compare whether those controls that you have stated are the same thing with those ones in the Annex A control, and verify that no necessary controls have been omitted. I audited an organization some time ago, some years ago, and then they excluded the critical control. The control was speaking to security of assets off premise, security of assets off premise. And what they mentioned, the justification for exclusion of that control then was because they do not have any assets off premise. And I said that is wrong. Because the control of the Annex A or the controls that you'll be implementing are not to be reactive controls, but they should be proactive in most cases. Some can be reactive, but in most cases, they should be proactive control. So you are not going to wait until you have an asset that is away from your environment. Let's say, for instance, somebody is coming to fix your CCTV camera, it went bad. Somebody is coming to pick a particular server from the organization, or someone is coming to fix your generator that used to power the organization, and they need to move it away from the premise. Is it until that time that you now start putting process in place? So the standard is saying that ensure that no necessary controls are omitted. And that is why you need expert opinion when you're implementing, including or excluding control. And then produce what we call a statement of applicability. Statements applicability. A document that states whether a particular control is applicable to you as an organization or not. That's what a statement of applicability is all about. And then it says formulate an information security risk treatment plan. You are going to have a risk assessment plan. You are going to have a risk treatment plan. And the risk assessment plan and treatment plan will be the implementation of the process documents. So what the process had stated that you should do, you are now going to implement it, whether via Excel sheet or whether via a standard tool, if the organization can afford one. And then it says obtain risk owners' approval of information security risk treatment plan and acceptance of the residual information security risk. So once you have carried out your risk treatment, ensure that there's proper approval of that risk treatment plan, and then ensure that the residual risk is within your risk appetite or not. If it is not, you can still accept it. So now this is just to also let us know that not all high risks will an organization treat. Not all risk above organizational risk appetite will be treated. But then there must be a documentation that states that management is accepting that high risk. So that when there is an issue, management will not come for you and say, this particular risk, why didn't we close it? So if you have mentioned, if there's a risk that is above the risk appetite and you have communicated to management and they're not doing anything about it, let them accept that risk and then let there be a documentation that shows that management is accepting that particular risk. And I do not think any auditor will penalize you for accepting the high risk. And so it's dependent if there is appropriate justification, right? So that's clause 6.1.2 and 6.1.3. However, we have more risk management standard. Now, 27,001, the risk assessment in 27,001, remember I mentioned that it is asset-based, right? And it is focused on information security risk assessment. Now, who can tell me the difference between 31,000 and 27,001? If you can tell us risk management in 27,001, risk management in 31,000, who can tell us the difference? If you can tell us, raise your hand. I'll call you. If you can tell us the difference between risk management in 27,001 and 31,000, raise your hand. I'll call you. Nobody. Yes, Folashade.
Okay, I just want to take a guess actually. Reading through this, that I say that is not intended for certification purposes. I think the one for 27,001 is intended for certification purposes. And this is saying it's not intended for certification purposes.
Okay.
Not sure.
Let's hear. Thank you for Lashadi. Let's hear Bukumi.
Okay, let me just make a guess. So I guess for the one for 27,001, that one is related to information security. While the one for 31,000 is related to like all aspects, like not just information security alone, can work for other things. So basically, I don't know if I'm correct.
Okay. So yes, very, very correct, Bukumi. Very, very correct. For Lashade, you are correct too, but I was specific to risk management, not the whole standard entirely. So yeah, the standard entirely 27,001 is certifiable, 31,000 is not certifiable, right? But in terms of risk management in 27,001 is asset-based and is focused on information security. However, risk management in 31,000 is focused on all types of security, all types of risk, whether information security, whether credit risk, whether insurance risk, whether liquidity risk, whether human resource risk, whether people risk, whether management risk. It is focused on um, that, right? So yeah, 31,000 provides a common approach for risk management. It can be applicable to any type of risk, just like I mentioned, and it is not intended for certification process, right? We have 27,005. So 27,005 will teach you how to implement. You see, imagine having now. I studied the material overnight, yesterday till this morning, right? So 27,004. I think I explained what 27,004 is on the first day. And I said 27,004 will help you implement performance evaluation effectively. And I saw a lot of things that opened my head. Like, so this is like very, very fantastic. And I think I'll take a training around performance, because a lot of organizations, they are not doing it right. They're not doing it right. And then they're wasting time and energy on whatever they are doing. And the painful part is, you will see the same implementation process in almost every organization that you audit. It's more like the document is just flying up and down, and then there's nobody that actually sits to review these controls, these standards, to say, okay, what is this standard actually saying, right? So now imagine having 27,005. 27,005, I think the document is even more than the old 27,001 standard. And what 27,005 will teach you is clause 6.1.2 and 6.1.3. So imagine having a document, just one document, a full standard, teaching you how to implement clause 6.1.2 and 6.1.3. So this is where you will see how you can carry out proper risk management. And these are some of the documents that I expect security managers like you and I to sit down, not just reading the standard alone, to sit down and actually review these documents and then get more insight from them. So it is applicable to any organization that intends to manage risk that compromise. You can see 27,005 is focused on what? Information security, because it is for 27,001. It is standard for 27,001. And then organizations cannot obtain certification against this also, because it is a guideline, right? So that's that. Now, this is the risk management, typical risk management process. I've explained this at length, right? I think it is my, okay, yeah, it is moving. My network is the one lagging. So I've explained this at length. It starts from context establishment. From your context, you have identified your internal and external issues, you have identified your risk appetite, you have documented your criteria for carrying out risk assessment. Once you are done with context establishment, you go to risk identification. That is where you identify, and this extract is from 27,005. So you can see the document explains what risk management is, right? And I told us that risk management is different from risk assessment. So risk management contains risk assessment and risk treatment. So don't let us make mistake. Understand? Because there are questions that we say, what is a risk assessment process? Typical exam question. So risk assessment process is risk identification, risk analysis, and evaluation. If you add treatment to it, you have failed the question. So once you are done with context establishment, it goes to identification of risk. Once you have identified the assets, you have identified the threats, you have identified the vulnerabilities, you have identified likelihood and impact, it goes on to analysis. So this is where you multiply the likelihood and impact. And then once you get your risk score, you evaluate your risk score. So once you evaluate your risk score, is the assessment satisfactory? If yes, you send it to risk treatment. If it's not satisfactory, you ensure that you take it back again. It follows that same process, right? And then in as much as you are implementing this, it has to, there must be risk communication and consultation. You have to consult risk owners, people that owns that particular risk, and then there must be monitoring and review also. And as you're carrying out this also, there must be documented information, right? To show that this is actually being done, right? So that's the time is running now. Hey, I thought to be able to do documented information today. So let's quickly look at the risk management process. So context establishment, blah blah. We can leave all of this methodology. So now you can see the process of risk management, right? Sorry, let me hold on for the document to load up my network. Okay, yeah, it's up. So look at risk identification. Who can read out what we have in? Okay, let me call Busayo more. Can you read out what we have here for risk identification? Sorry, it's not on the call.
Do you want me to go on?
The call, I'm
Yeah, yes.
trying to open it to make it
Busayo, let
larger
Busayo
now.
go on. Okay. Yeah, Busayo. So read what we have under risk identification for us.
Okay, under risk identification. Okay, the first one is identification of assets, then identification of threats. We have identification of existing controls, then identification of vulnerabilities, identification of risks.
Okay. Okay. So this document is in the author's context, right? So, but you can have a different view as you grow within this implementation. So under identification, I think you're also going to identify your impact and likelihood, because it is when you identify it, then you now carry out an analysis by multiplying both of them together. So you identify the assets, and why it is important that you identify the assets is because I remember the first day I said you cannot protect what you don't have, and you cannot protect what you have, but you do not know that you have it. So if you as an organization can document all of your assets within your organization, it will be easy for you to identify the threats and vulnerabilities applicable to each of those assets, and then the existing controls you have in place to ensure that those threats do not materialize. And then you also identify the risk owners. All right. So, and then it goes on to analysis, goes on to evaluation, goes on to treatment. Right. So let's start with so you can be asset based or event based. I've mentioned that, but in most cases you will see organization using the asset based approach. Right. So identification of assets. Let's allow this load up. My network is quite slow tonight. So in identifying assets, you are identifying primary, which is your primary and business assets, or secondary assets. Have we are we seeing the assets yet, or is still the previous slide that you are seeing?
So I can't see anything.
Wow. I don't know what's happening this night with my network. Let me stop sharing again.
Maybe I should find this thing and
You said what?
like I'm thinking of looking for document and help broadcast this.
Okay.
Okay, we can see your screen now.
Okay, let's just keep managing it. Right now, so you start from identification of assets. I've talked about this. So we also looked at what assets are, I think, in our last class or in our last two classes. Right. So you need to identify the primary business assets and the supporting assets. So when we say primary business assets, we are talking about like company plans, relevant policies, like resource documents. Those are core primary business assets. You need to identify those assets, documented assets that you have. Then supporting assets like your laptop, your desktop, servers, network, infrastructure, blah, 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 and the likes. So organization needs to identify those assets. Then we have cloud assets also, right? People assets. You need to identify the people within the organization, because you need to carry out a risk assessment on people also. When we get to practicalization of the risk assessment, I'll show us how to carry out risk assessments on people. So also your servers, your website, any information processing facility or any system that has the capacity to process, store, or collect information are to be added as information assets, and you need to identify them. We are not talking about chairs, we're not talking about tables. So when we are talking about identification of assets that are going to carry out an assessment on, we are not talking about chairs and table, right? Sorry, I have a call. Let me just quickly. Okay, so we are talking about any system that is able to manage, collect, process, or store information assets. Right. So once you identify the asset, so I don't want to spend too much time on the primary and secondary asset. I've talked about them, and then in our last class also, I've talked about them at length. Even threats, I've explained what threats are. You understand? So you identify the threats, you identify the vulnerabilities. We've talked about all of this in our last class. So let me see if I can just skip them. Okay, let me just go to existing control. Let me go to existing controls. Okay, yeah, great. I'm in a meeting. Okay, so part of the things that I did not talk about when we were looking at information security technologies are existing controls. Now, once you are carrying out an identification within your risk assessment, you need to identify the controls that are in place initially before you carry out risk treatment, right? So to ensure the identification of existing and planned security controls, a comparison against the set of controls established in Annex A can be performed. What this is typically saying is, let's say for instance, you have identified one of the assets as laptop. You have identified threats as virus. You have identified vulnerability as lack of antivirus. Now, existing control within your organization, let's say this is the first time you're implementing the ISMS and the business is just starting up. Maybe you do not even have any existing control in place. You need to document it, that there are no existing controls in place. So these are the things that will give you insights into the likelihood of occurrence of that threat. Because imagine a company that do not have a control for virus. What is the likelihood that that virus will occur? The likelihood is high. What is the impact if that virus will occur? The impact is high. So that likelihood and that impact, that is where you are able to get your risk score, right? Because you have identified the assets, you have identified the threats and vulnerability, you have identified the existing control, and then based on your review, right, you are able to identify the likelihood and impact if the risk were to materialize. And so that's typically what existing control is talking about. Before you treat a risk, what are the controls you have in place within the organization before risk treatment? And you identify vulnerabilities. I've talked about vulnerabilities. And then you identify risk owners. So risk owners are people that have the authority. They are process owners to manage a particular risk. For instance, all the laptops and desktops within the company, it is either the IT head or maybe the CTO that will be the risk owner. All right, maybe the IT head or the CTO will be the risk owner. For people also, I know that this thing has not moved, but it's well. So let's try and look up the document also. Right. So when I'm sharing also, please let's be looking at the document from our end so that we can, yeah. So the risk owner should be identified also. For people, risk around people, Oluwasonya John, who do you think should be the risk owner?
Hello, sir. For the risk around people, I think the human resource person, the human resource manager, should be the risk owner.
Yes, human resource manager. Right. So in most cases, risk owner should be people that has authority over a particular process or asset, that asset that you are auditing, that are carrying out a risk assessment on at that particular time. They should be the risk owner, right? So once you identify the risk owner, it goes on to this thing has stopped again. Okay, this system needs elder brother true. It's getting tired. Okay, so once we are done with risk owner, then you go on to risk analysis. So you can see I've explained risk analysis, right? Where you assess potential consequence, the impact if that risk were to materialize. So if that virus happens and then there is an issue within the system, what is the impact? Also, so you can see, depending on your risk matrix, it can either be 5x5, it can be 3x3, it can be 9x9. So, but if you are seeing my screen, you see that this is a 5. Oh Jesus, this thing has not updated. This thing is stressing me this night. Oh.
Should I off?
Okay, Folashade, can you present from your end?
Okay.
I don't know what's wrong with this system today. So you know where I am now. So just present from that point.
Okay, let me okay. I think this is the last page.
I am on
Page
scroll down.
105. I think page 105, 106.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, go to 105 or 106.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, scroll down to 106.
Man, I'm making my own
Okay.
system too.
Okay, so I was saying, right, that you can use either a 3x3, a 5x5. Some organization they will use a 3x3. So yeah, it is possible you'll be seeing low, medium, high. But then this is a 5x5. This is just in the author's context. But you can also adopt this. And you can see that it starts from minor, which is 1, 2, which is significant, 3, which is serious, 4, which is critical, and then 5, which is catastrophic. And this is what I'm also going to use to explain the risk assessment to you tomorrow when we practicalize it, right? So and you can see the different description. One means negligible. So if you do not have an antivirus on the system, and then there is virus on that system, what do you think the impact will be? If we do not want to lie to ourselves, it's either it will be serious, or it will be critical, or it is going to be catastrophic. Because I've seen cases where organizations carry out risk assessment, and then you will see the risk owner telling you that I don't want high risk, just put everything low. And it's very funny because high risk help you to be informed and also help you to inform management to put appropriate controls in place, right? So when you're carrying out risk assessments, right, or risk management altogether, ensure that you carry out proper assessment, right? So scroll down. Okay, I think that's about okay. That's on the quizzes. Have you scrolled? Yeah, scroll to 108. Okay, great. No, stay on 108. Stay on 108. Okay. Now you assess the likelihood. You have looked at impact. You assess the likelihood of occurrence of that risk. You do not have a gate in your compound. Apart from that gate, you don't have a door in the house. The likelihood that thieves will come into your house is high. You don't need to lie to yourself. So likelihood is you are going to look at the scenario, right? The trend of that particular threat. If it has happened before in your organization, or maybe because of the lack of absence of existing controls, or maybe because of the lack of absence of a preventive control, you can say, oh, the likelihood is going to be this, is going to be that, and then you carry out assessment of your likelihood. Scroll down. Okay, and then you can see we have different likelihood scale. You can see this one is 0 to 7, right? But if you are using a 5x5 matrix, you should use 1 to 5 because you have used 1 to 5 in your consequence. So once you are using what's it called, 5x5, use 1 to 5 in your consequence. Consequence can also be known as impact. Use 1 to 5 also in your likelihood. So we have maybe you can start from very rare, rare, possible, very possible, likely, right? And then almost common. Or you can start from rare, possible, very possible, likely, almost common. Just take 1 to 5, and then because of that thing that you have, because of that definition, you'll be able to identify the likelihood of occurrence of a particular risk. And then this definition is not generic, right? Does not it means you can make a change to it, you can define it however it suits the organization. But then even when you are defining, ensure that you follow best practice, right? So after assessment of likelihood, you carry out the determination of risk. Scroll down to 111 to determine the level of risk. That is where you multiply your impact and consequence. So it says the level of risk can be determined in many possible ways. It is commonly, remember I told us that it is commonly determined by combination of the likelihood and consequence. However, alternative calculations can include an asset value as well as likelihood and consequence. So there are various ways you can identify your risk level, right? But then the most commonly used one is the multiplication of your likelihood and impact, which also makes sense, or what we call likelihood and consequence. So in addition, the calculation is not necessarily linear. It can be likelihood squared combined with the consequence. Sometimes it is likelihood multiplied by the CIA, impact on confidentiality, impact on integrity, impact on availability, divided by 3. So there are various ways you can do it, but as you're starting up, you can start with the multiplication of your likelihood and impact. And in any case, the level of risk should be determined using the criteria established in 6.4.3.4. So what this is saying is that in any case, ensure that the likelihood, when you are determining your level of risk, it should be what you have already stated within your process document, right? Let it be what you have documented, and that should be what you should be implementing. And then also within 27,005, you will see various ways on how you can carry out an assessment of risk using likelihood, impact, and any other criteria that you can use, right? So, and then you determine the level. Scroll down. You determine the level of your risk, right? So you can see we have the likelihood, we have the consequence. So we have likelihood on the left, we have consequence up above, and then you multiply, right? So you multiply the likelihood and the consequence, and then you're able to get your risk value, right? And then you'll be good to go to either avoid the risk, mitigate the risk, accept the risk, or transfer the risk. Scroll down, please. And once you are done with that, you go on to evaluation. So I talked about evaluation, right? So you evaluate the level of risk based on your risk evaluation criteria, right? So you look at your risk appetite, and then you compare the result of your risk analysis with your risk appetite, and then you determine your risk treatment, right? So, and then that takes you to risk treatment. So scroll down to go to 1119. 119 rather. 119. So once you have evaluated, I've explained this in at length too. So I'm just trying to explain more. Yeah. So once you have evaluated, you go to risk treatment, right? So you formulate and select risk treatment option from what clause 6.1.3 is saying, and then they are making a reference also from ISO 31000. So you formulate and select risk treatment options, you plan and implement risk treatment plan, you assess the effectiveness of that treatment, you decide whether the remaining risk is acceptable, that is your residual risk, determine whether it's acceptable. If it is not acceptable, you take it for further treatment. If you are going to accept it as an organization, you accept the risk. And then scroll down, let's look at the various risk treatment options that we have, right? So we have risk avoidance, we have risk modification, we have risk retention, we have risk sharing. So risk retention is the same thing as risk acceptance, right? So risk avoidance is cancellation or modification of an activity or set of activities related to risk. I'll show us typical examples of risk avoidance tomorrow. Risk modification, you are mitigating the risk, you are putting a control to lessen the effect of that risk, right? Risk retention, You're not doing anything to the risk, you're accepting it, you are taking it in like that. Risk sharing, you are passing the risk to an external person, maybe to an insurance company, or maybe to any company, right? So you are passing the risk. That's what risk sharing is all about. And then these are the risk treatment options that we have. So based on your risk, what's it called? Based on your risk assessment results, you carry out an evaluation, you put treatment in place, whether you are accepting, you are mitigating, you are transferring, or you are avoiding that risk. And then when you have residual risks, ensure that decision makers and other stakeholders are aware of the nature and extent of the remaining risk treatment. So once you are done, carry out a risk treatment, and there's a remaining risk, whether it's within the risk appetite or above, let the risk owner know, and let there be an acceptance, right? And then that risk should be continually monitored. The risk should be continually monitored. So we have three types of risk. Go to page 125. We have three types of risk. So we have inherent risk. These are the risks that you have within an organization without any control. You have not implemented any control. And then we have treated risk. These are the risks that you have treated with controls. And then we have residual risks. These are risks that are remaining after risk. And then let's have these terminologies at the back of our mind, because questions will also come. I've given us too much expo. Questions will also come out of them. And then as we are doing that, we ensure that we continually monitor the risk, we communicate the risk to relevant people, and then we ensure that we record, because you need to record the evidence of the risk, your risk assessment process, your risk treatment process, your risk assessment plan, your risk treatment plan. So all of these are the evidence of your risk management process. And then you have a fantastic process within the organization, right? So that's about risk management. Clauses 6.1.1, 6.1.2, and 6.1.3. Tomorrow we'll look at clause 7. We'll practicalize risk assessment, and then we'll look at clause 6.2, information security objective. If you have questions, I'll take the question before we call it a night. Any question? Any question? Any question? Okay.
I have a
The absence
question.
of
I was looking for my
all
hands
right.
up icon. I was not able to find that.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. While you were teaching, thank you for the class. While you were teaching, you were making mention of other standards like ISO 27004 and 5. So we don't feel overwhelmed, because someone like me, the way you've mentioned it, I feel like, oh, I should really catch up on this, and I'm not even done with this one yet. So how would you advise that we study these things so that like we don't get overwhelmed? Everybody can like everybody can like how would I put it? They know how to like manage the workload and all, but how would you advise that we study these things so that there is a flow in understanding?
Okay. So stay on 27,001, 27,002, and 27. In fact, stay on 27,001 for now. You understand? And 27,002. Leave the rest. Do you understand? So stay on those, and then this material that you have. Do you understand? So as you grow, you get to be able to have time to pick other things. Like you know that you don't have a choice. You need to learn more. So I've gotten to a point where I think I need to do things differently, right? And then so that I'll be able to give my clients value, and then give people that I train value also. And I saw a lot of things when I looked at 27,004 that if some of us look at it now, we'll be very, very confused. So just stay on the one that stay on the standard, which is 27,000, and put your focus there, build your strength there. Once you have built there, you can now start looking into other standards, right, that supports the implementation of the 27,001. Right. The thing about this field is that you don't stop learning. See, you will continue to learn. You will continue to learn, like in study. So and that's right. So yeah. So if an organization has limited resources, how should you decide which risk to mitigate, avoid them? It is from your risk appetite. So before you choose a risk appetite, you must have factored in the resources you have, financial resources, people resources, and a lot of other things. Then you now pick a risk appetite. So once you have picked the risk appetite, any risk above your risk appetite, you need to treat them. If you're not treating them, you need to accept them. Right. So irrespective, you've seen companies with 2 staff, you carry out your risk management process and you ensure that you do it effectively. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay. Do you have any other question? Any other question? Okay, so tomorrow we are going to look at particularized risk assessments, and then we'll look at clause 7. Right. So let's enjoy our night, and thank you for Lashadi for sharing the screen. Right. Bye everyone. I'm going to upload tonight's recording also, maybe later tonight.